passed on straight party lines. And what Republicans said in passing that bill was we needed to strengthen voting laws. I mean, they actually said they were trying to protect the right to vote. They adopted the language of, of our struggle protecting the right to vote. Um, but again, it was based on that lie that somehow there was an election that was stolen from any particular candidate, which is a microaggression. I mean, it is a gaslighting of Black people in the highest form. And then it was based on this misbelief that there was fraud going on when it came to who was able to cast a ballot. And again, there was no evidence of any of that. Nonetheless, they pushed through this bill, which facially is neutral. It's not as if the bill says, we're going to make it more difficult for Black people to vote. But what it did do was it reduced the number of early voting locations, hours, ballot boxes, and it impacted the metro Atlanta area, like Fulton County, for example, fewer ballot boxes. Now the ballot boxes were no longer accessible 24 hours. And we know when you start limiting the time, the place where people can cast a ballot, then you are in effect blocking certain people from being able to participate in this democracy that we have and being able to use their voice as their vote. So, again, you're right. It's all forms of the different microaggressions. But when we see stuff like Senate Bill 202, and we are being told by society, no, this isn't to disenfranchise Black people. You're right. As Black voters in particular, we see it, we spot it, and we know better because we know despite President Obama's historic election, we still very much so live in a racialized culture, a racialized society, and therefore that society, when it comes to our access to the voting ballot to cast our ballots, it's still limited. They're still attempting to limit it. And I'll also tell you this, again, it was not coincidence that after the 2020 census, we knew and it's now confirmed that for the first time, Georgia is considered a minority majority state. When you look at, we gained almost 1 million new voters in the state of Georgia, and those were people of color. So do you think that it was not strategic that as Republicans head into this 2022 gubernatorial race, where Stacey was able to get this close to beating Brian Kemp, that there were not going to be changes when you have a legislature that is Republican controlled? And let me just give this disclaimer, because I'm going to keep it all the way real with y'all today. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself. This is Sharice Michelle Reyes speaking. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated just because I am the social action chair for our chapter. So I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to keep it real with y'all. So let me go ahead and give that disclaimer. So yeah, they're running scared. And when people have power and they run scared, what they do is they legislate us out of opportunities. And that's what happened with Senate Bill 202.
Thank you,
Sharice. Yeah, your sorors are letting you know you're on fire, girl.
They should be used to me. My sorors get this every chapter meeting. They know how I get down. But it's important, and I'm passionate about it. And this sort of leads into what we're here to talk about. Where does that passion go?
Right.
When you run into time and time again, the microaggressions? I think about what James Baldwin said all the time. To be Black and live in America is to be in that constant state of rage. And I know it wasn't just me, and it's not just, the right to vote and protecting the right to vote. I know back in May, June of 2020, in the height of a pandemic, where we were losing people left, right, and center, I felt compelled to go out and either protest with the protesters in the city of Atlanta, or I volunteer with the ACLU as a legal observer to go and protect the right of the protesters to protest, because, you know, we were dealing with voter disenfranchisement that had just happened after the 2018 election. Because if there was ever an election that was stolen, it was the one stolen from Stacey Abrams to be our governor here in the state of Georgia. So we were dealing with that. We were dealing with the deaths of unarmed Black men. You know, it was George Floyd. Before we could even get through saying his name, we were saying Ahmaud Arbery's name. We were saying Rashard Brooks. I mean, it was just named Breonna Taylor name. And, you know, and it's hard to be confronted with that, with the idea that society devalues us so much because of the color of our skin. And for those of us who are parents, you know, there was a fear I had, and anxiety, quite frankly, Dr. Brown, that I think I started to experience, a fear of what if this were my child. And so, you know, when you would see the Facebook messages pop up, I can't keep quiet because I have a Black son, I have a Black husband, I have a Black uncle. You know, what we didn't realize, probably collectively as a people, Black folk, we were living under constant stress, race-related stressors, and constant anxiety during that time period. And it's, you know, and I know for me, I'm big on, you know, having discussions openly about my mental health, but in our community, that isn't always the case. So
Right.
I had to step away from TV, step away from social media, and quite frankly, take a moment every once in a while and step away from my activism, because I realized the impact it was having on my mental health. And I realized I couldn't be good to the movement if I couldn't step away and take care of myself. So, Dr. Brown, I don't know if you've experienced that or you had clients who experienced that, but you know, it truly was this constant state of anxiety.
Right.
Yeah, it's actually called hypervigilance. You know, when you're on edge, you're on 10. And you know, like we pay for this. We pay like our for generations, for hundreds of years, we have carried the movement on our backs. And you know, to recognize that just like, you know, two generations ago, that we're having to protest, that we're having to make sacrifices in our own lives to make sure that we take off from work to get to the polls on time, and to make sure that we are having these conversations with our children, you know, even as much as, you know, all of the conversations around education and whether or not white children ultimately should be exposed to the true history of this country, how often it is that we as Black parents don't even have the opportunity to, we don't have the choice. We don't have the privilege of saying, well, I don't want my child to know about these things because my child was in kindergarten as this was happening and she was starting to ask questions and even still ask me, why don't some white people like Black people? These conversations aren't the conversations that are necessarily happening in white homes, but that's part of their privilege, is that they can decide whether or not they want to have these conversations with their children. They can decide whether or not they want to give their children a filtered version of history, while we're doubling down, tripling down, trying to teach our children British history, American history, and then separately African American history. And so, you know, there were lots of my clients who were just exhausted, you know, that this, between the pandemic, the political stuff going on, you know, the murder, quite frankly, of George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, like that it hit so close to home for us that we do pay. We pay in loss of sleep. We pay in other health side effects. So, you know, when we are sublimating, when we're pushing all these emotions down, it leads us to other unhealthy behaviors. It leads us to drinking more. It leads us to weight gain. It leads us to hypertension. That cost is triple fold on us.
Yeah, I mean, even when you talked about like your kids and, you know, the privilege to shield certain children from the truth. When I was moving down to Georgia in 2015, I said to my daughter, who was in kindergarten at the time, I said, you know, I said, you know, your school that you're going to go to it's a little bit more diverse. And she said, well, what does that mean? I said, more white people, more Black people, more people of various different backgrounds will all be in school together, and you're going to benefit from that. And she said to me, but white people don't always like Black people. And I said, well, Maya, yes, there are some instances of that, but I had sort of, as a parent, I almost had bought into this, but President Obama was a Black man and things have changed. And she in kindergarten said, but what about Ruby Bridges? And I said, well, baby, that was a long time ago. And she said to me, well, what about these other things that have been on the news about things that are going on to Black students, in school? And this was kindergarten. And this wasn't even something that I had really sought out to teach her about, but she lived as a Black child in America. She experienced her Blackness even at the age of 5. And she was informed enough to know that things are different. And again, it's because of those microaggressions that we even see our children experiencing at their age. So, going back to Nadia, you had talked about voting in politics. In 2013, the Supreme Court heard a case, Shelby versus Holder, and what they were attempting to do was strike down a portion of the Voting Rights Act. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4, or a portion of it, and they said it's because when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, they had relied on data showing that there were these disparate outcomes as it relates to Black individuals in the South and their right to vote. And so the Supreme Court says in 2013, but that's 40 years old. That data is old. And it's no longer responsive to our community needs. And what happened? After 2013, you had a bunch of states, Georgia included, who turned right around and changed their voting laws in a way that disenfranchised Black voters. And then you had organizations such as Black Voters Matter that we've partnered, that the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority has partnered with. And we've gone into these low voter turnout communities and areas, and you're talking with voters and you realize it's not that they don't care about issues. It's not that they don't care about what is happening to our communities. It's because, as Dr. Brown said, they've been denied the right to participate. They maybe couldn't take off and sit in a line for 4 or 5 hours to cast the ballot, or they did it, they cast the ballot, and then in 2020, the Georgia legislature passed the bill that's making it even more difficult and would criminalize. We are talking about criminalizing volunteers who would pass out water. What kind of evil society are we that we would not want to encourage volunteers to pass out food and water to people standing in line for 12 hours to vote? It is crazy. I mean, and again, you're not going to look us in the eye and tell us, as Black people who are experiencing our Blackness, when we each and every time we attempt to go and vote, that was done in a way that was race neutral.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in this post-racial environment that data is still showing that adults and children as young as 8, up to 70% of adults report experiencing racial stressors daily, and at least 90% experience racial stressors at least on a weekly basis. So, as much as our culture at large would like to say, oh, we're acknowledged we're in a better place than we were in 1960. And then you look up at the end of 2020 and it looks a lot like 1960 all over again. And so I think building on that continued progress, but it can be very exhausting for us. It can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, the level of fighting that we have to do, and rolling up our sleeves. But that's why even going back to giving yourself permission sometimes, checking in with yourself and giving yourself permission to tap out, and even utilizing white allies who are willing to carry the torch a little bit, and really, utilizing other people who have it right now. But sometimes we can't, this is a marathon and we can't run a marathon at a sprinter's pace, so we have to take care of ourselves, take care of our families, and make sure that we are refueling ourselves so that we are here to continue to fight the good fight.
Yeah, and that's not excellent point that you talk about in terms of how to utilize allies, or as some people, I like to call them co-conspirators, right? Because an ally, you're going to get in the struggle with us, stand right next to us. Because when we were marching, and there was this one particular young organization, and when I say young organization and young folk, I'm talking about 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And they were organizing using social media. So they would just pick a time and a place and meet up. They didn't get permits, they weren't worried about getting permits. And so whenever some of us who were legal observers would hear where they were going to be, we would go out there as legal observers, trying our best to protect their right to vote, to observe. And then one thing I noticed was when there were uncomfortable exchanges with law enforcement, I would see our white co-conspirators going to the front of the line, putting their bodies between the Black protesters and law enforcement to provide that cover. And I thought, you know what, that's right. Use your privilege for protection and not oppression. So you're right. Sometimes we have to know when to, as Black folk, to take a step back for our mental health, and quite frankly, for our freedom in that instance, because they were not arresting those white co-conspirators, but they were going to start arresting those Black folk. So yeah, and and in terms of the politics of it, after 2020, with the massive voter turnout, particularly in minority communities, it is sometimes hard to get certain voters to the polls, but those voters showed up and showed out in 2020. And we know here in the state of Georgia what happened, right? We turned Georgia blue. We elected not one but two Democratic senators, and Senator Warnock and John Ossoff. And again, we were rewarded with Senate Bill 202. But it wasn't just Georgia. The Brennan Center for Justice looked at in October of this year just how many states had passed or were attempting to pass restrictive or new restrictive voting laws, and there were at least 19 states that had passed 33 separate laws, right? And of course, we're talking about Georgia, Texas, and our neighbors to the south, good old Florida. Florida's going Florida, but again, it just goes to show that the reward for the great work we did was more oppression. And that sometimes can also, lead to hopelessness. It's like, we're doing all of this, we're sacrificing so much. I know I definitely sacrificed time with my children, with my activism, and I'm doing it to leave this world a better place for them and for everybody else's children. But it does sometimes, it leads to hopelessness, because it's like, oh, here we go. Now we got to, get back out there in the streets. There's never a down moment, or at least it feels like there's never a real down moment where we can just let our hair down and breathe and live. And it's like there's the cost that we pay just for being Black.
Thank you. And you're both right about that. What would be the time for us to regroup, in terms of taking care of ourselves, spending time with our family? Would it be during the in-between election season moments, or, in the moments where there aren't any political unrest happening because of racial acts by law enforcement? Right now in this moment, the holiday season, the holiday time is taken over as the forefront. But we saw what happened last year when January came back around, and there was a difference in the political unrest of the group that charged the Capitol, and that caused a lot of stress and strife, to see the possibility that other decisions can be made. I know that I myself was wondering, will, the reaction be the same? And of course it wasn't. And that just taking in that stress and taking in all of the confirmation that no matter, or at least the thought that no matter what I might do for myself or what I might do to teach my children to how to respond to police officers or people of authority, that really the bottom line is going to be based on how the other person is accepting or is not accepting of the color of my child's skin. So how do we recognize when we need a break? Is it something internal? I know that Dr. Brown, you mentioned basically listening to your body, paying attention to your behaviors related to sleep or hypertension. What are some ways that we can better be in tune to know when we need to stop, even though we still have the passion, even though we still want to be involved and make a contribution towards a fight that maybe inches us along the way? Maybe we'll have some setbacks. And how do we maintain our mental health in the best, and our self-care in the best possible way?
I think, even just going back to that self-awareness, and when you recognize those changes in yourself, give me just a second. I'm going to pass it over to Sharice.
Yeah, so I mean, here's what I do, right? And this is my non-medical advice. You know when you need to take a step back. You know when you're exhausted. For me, I started to get sick, like physically sick. I had run myself down, and my mother was still alive at the time, and she would say to me, I was headed out one day, I had my little bullhorn, and I was headed out to protest, and I'm just hacking, coughing, and she said, "You need to go and be still." That's what our grandmothers used to tell us. You need to get somewhere, sit and be still, and let your body heal. And I actually did. I turned around that day. I went back in the house. I laid down because I realized that I was going to be good to no one if I ended up in a hospital somewhere because I did not listen to my body. One of the other things that I'll say is I learned to call in Black. And what does that mean? That means when that jury verdict was coming out in the trial against those officers who murdered, or the officer who murdered George Floyd,
Right.
I took leave that afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
I took sick leave, you have annual leave, or whatever it is your job calls it. Use that leave on those days. I refuse to go to work with an experienced trauma.
Right.
And this is how I knew I wasn't going to experience trauma for a non-Black audience. And this is how I knew, because that particular day we were on pins and needles, like all my friends texting each other or social media, on pins and needles about that verdict, because in the back of our minds and in the pit of our stomach, we were all unsure of what that verdict was going to be.
Absolutely.
We had hope, but we also know to expect to be disappointed almost each and every time. And so there was that anxiety building up. And I was talking to a coworker, and they said, "Oh, Sharice, you don't sound like yourself." No, how am I supposed to be? Do you understand what's going on? And the response was, "Oh, I didn't realize that was happening today." I said, "You know what, Sharice, take leave. Take leave, because those are also some microaggressions, right? The unintentional ones.
Absolutely.
That there are major things happening to Black people in this country collectively. And yes, George Floyd was all of our sons that day when he
Absolutely.
called out for his mother. He was all of our fathers that day when his daughter was asking how she was going to live her life without her father. And so we experienced that collectively as a people. So when that verdict was coming out, when the verdict was coming out just a couple of weeks ago in the Ahmaud Arbery case. And we
Yes,
saw that man get on that stand with them crocodile tears
yes.
and tell us that he had to defend himself. We were gaslit throughout that trial. That lawyer, our lawyer who stood up and asked for Black pastors to be put out of the courtroom as if their presence alone, the presence of Black pastors, was going to influence the jury. That is absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous, but we experience those microaggressions as a people. And I refuse, even though I still work from home, I refuse to experience that with individuals or co-workers who are going to pretend as if it was not happening to Black people and was not happening to society. So I took leave. So that's my advice, my non-medical advice. Take leave when you're going through these things. Call in Black if you need to.
But I like your point, Sharice, about, see it coming, like mark it on the calendar that, you when you know that verdict is going to come in, make sure that you're in a space that allows you for a certain level of sanctity and safety. One of the things that we were talking about is recognizing those changes within yourself, right? Like when you know that your shoulders feel, you're wearing your shoulders like earrings and you're not sleeping well and you're starting to act out and you're not exercising and you're not kind of staying with those practices that are good for your body. I think that's the first cue. When you see, like, I'm acting different, I'm changing, I need to do something about this, I need to push back. I think the separate thing that Sharice really highlighted well is, when you hear it from other people around you, when your children are like, Mom, why are you been so mean lately? Or why are you so irritated? Or you're with your spouse and your spouse feels like you're short, or your coworkers or your mother or your sisters or your sorors call you out on, hey, you're not doing the things that you're usually doing. What's going on with you? To even use that as an opportunity to kind of check in with yourself and to hear that they're seeing changes in you. And perhaps that's a time to step back. I do a lot of work with Delta Airlines. And so I talk a lot about the importance of putting the mask on yourself first. So why do you put the mask on yourself first? It's because if you don't take care of you, you won't be here to take care of other people. So the most loving thing that you can do as daughters, church members, mothers, sisters, is to take care of yourself so that you are here later on when someone else needs you. But we cannot pour from an empty cup. So it is the most selfless thing that you can do is to take care of yourself so that you are here to fight the good fight, to help others, to be a part of things. And I think the other thing that I really wanted to go back to is that we can't do all of this all the time. Like, as individuals, as much of a superwoman as Sharice is, she cannot carry all of this on her back. And so for us to feel comfortable saying, you know what, I need to sit on the sidelines for a minute. I need to regroup. I need to take a break, but we don't want to lose momentum, So making sure that we are passing the torch on to somebody else and saying, I can't run this leg of the sprint. Sis, brother, do you have it? Can you run this leg? And I'm going to pull back for a month. I'm going to be sitting on a beach somewhere, reading a book with a cocktail in my hand, and I'm going to refuel myself so I can come back and continue with this work and continue to have an impact in our communities.
Absolutely. And we have a couple of questions that came in through the chat. Sharice, you touched on this. And so we have a question related to what advice would you give minorities that commonly work in predominantly white spaces regarding not becoming resentful or bitter towards their white counterparts for the difference in privilege, perspective, and power that they are given? You both actually touched on this, but what would you say? Sharice said, you take your time that you have, but any other suggestions in that space? Should you respond? Should you take those moments to educate? Is it even worth the energy or effort to do that?
I think you have to know who you're dealing with. My grandmother and my mother used to tell us all the time, consider the source, right? You know the people who are intentionally engaging in inappropriate behavior toward Black people in the workplace. And when they do and say certain things, they're hoping to bait you into a discussion. One thing I had to come to a realization towards, particularly being a manager in the federal government, is I'm not going to debate my humanity with anybody in a workplace. I'm not going to do it. Now, there are some times where there are instances for education. Yes. For example, I've had colleagues who may say things like, oh, we're going to put up a Chinese wall, or I'm the low man on the totem pole. And because I work in a federal environment where the work that I do is dealing with discrimination laws, Title VII, I will correct those things to say, hey, you know, again, not in an aggressive manner, and I try to do it privately. Hey, that's really not appropriate to say in the workplace. And then I'll explain why. I've had to spend a lot of time educating my team, and some of my coworkers, on use of the term first world problems and why that's inappropriate. So there are some instances where you can go in and educate, but when it comes to somebody trying to bait me in, I'm not going to do that. And at the end of the day, you have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for those in the federal sector. And then, you know, the EOC also works with certain private sector employees who are covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That said, that I don't have to be subjected to these microaggressions in the workplace. That's harassment. If you are being subjected to unwanted, unwelcome conduct based on your membership in a protected class, that is unlawful. Right. And if it's impacting your ability to perform your official duties or your duties, it's actionable. So we as as a people, we have to learn. And as my mother would say, consider the source, consider the person. Is this an opportunity to educate somebody because they truly don't know? Or based on your history with that individual, are they trying to bait you into a race-related conversation in the workplace? Don't debate your humanity. That's when you exercise your rights as it relates to filing a complaint if it rises to that level, or you report it to HR or to management so that they can step in and take action before it becomes severe and pervasive in the work environment. Or in some instances, you're just going to call in black and say, not today, Karen, I'm not going there with you. So that's my
Yeah, and I would even add, you know, just like recognizing both your boundaries and all, and not apologizing for those boundaries. Like, boundaries are in place to keep everyone safe, and knowing that it's okay for you to say, this isn't a conversation that I'm willing to engage in, or I don't have the capacity. You know, if it's someone who's coming to you and they're not being malicious, the part where I'm most sensitive is I know, you know, I've worked in majority white environments where I know these people were not educated. They were not properly educated because they didn't get all the information. They got a redacted version of history, and that they believe that to be true. They don't read books. They just watch Fox News. That's where they get all their information from. But sometimes they really want to know. They really want to hear a different perspective. So for me to not feel like I have to stand there and teach all of history correctly, but to refer them. Like, if you really want to know, here's a list of books that are out there. If you are truly curious, if you truly want to educate yourself on a different perspective. Something very interesting that happened to me in 2016 was during Trump's inauguration. I was at work. I had no intention of watching that inauguration. I go into a meeting and they turn the inauguration on. And I sat there for a moment, and of course, I'm the only Black person at the table. I sat there for a moment and I thought, this isn't good for me. This isn't where I want to be. This isn't productive. This has nothing to do with the work that we're doing. So what I said to them was, hey, I'm going to go back to my desk and work for a little while. When you guys are ready to commence the meeting, give me a call and I'll come back down and we'll talk about work. We'll talk about oncology. But I think those are those moments where we have to recognize that it might be a toxic or unhealthy environment for us, and it's okay to leave. You know, we can be gracious. We don't have to flip tables. We don't have to set the room on fire, but recognizing that my health is my responsibility to take care of, and I don't have to keep myself in a toxic environment.
Thank you both for that. We have a part two to that question in relation to microaggressions in the workplace and responding when you want to assert yourself as an advocate for minorities, for Black people. How do you do that without being aggressive or being perceived to be aggressive. And I think that is a delicate balance that Black women, unfortunately, we have to hold.
Yeah, because the reality is you could go in as quiet as a church mouse and you may still be perceived as aggressive just by virtue of the subject matter on which you are speaking and advocating. You know, we live in a society, whether we want to, well, whether certain segments of the society want to acknowledge it or not, we still live in a very oppressed society. And so when you start talking about equaling the playing field for Black folk, guess what that means you're actually doing for those with white privilege? They are standing to lose something in theory so that you can gain. So just know that in some situations, you're never going to go into that conversation and be able to do it, regardless of what you say or don't say, without being perceived as aggressive. But Dr. Brown made an excellent point. There are so many resources in 2021 that you can point somebody to. The good Google is your friend if you're really interested in learning how to be a co-conspirator for Black people. And then for Black folk who are engaging in non-Black spaces on these subjects, have your talking points ready to go. If you know you're operating in certain spaces, have your talking points, stick to your talking points, have your facts, because one thing, particularly as a lawyer, we can argue about a whole lot of things, but facts speak for themselves. Have your facts so that when you are having conversation with individuals on these topics, you're doing it from an informed place and not an emotional place, because it's when we go to that emotional place is when people will start to gaslight you into, oh, well, you're angry. No, I'm angry. If your family had lived through what we had lived through in this country, you'd be angry too. And that's just like I say all the time. Or my mom used to say, if we as Black people were ever interested in doing to the larger society what was done to us, ironically, we'd be the ones viewed as being angry, but we're not even talking about that. So again, I say when you're going into these conversations, particularly in the workplace, like I said, it's tricky to have these types of conversations in the workplace unless this is the work that you do. So when you go into those conversations, going armed with facts, going armed with resources, and then also know when enough is enough and when to walk away from those conversations, because if you're not going to change minds overnight, and there are some people who you're not going to change their minds at all. So you have to know when to protect your peace and your employment and walk away from some of those conversations in the workplace.
Absolutely.
But to that point, I think even some of the political changes are because by 2035, white people will be a numerical minority in this country, and they're getting very nervous that we will treat them the way they treated us when brown people are in the numerical majority within this country. So I think because of that, because of their fear, they're starting to really belt tighten, and I think that's where you're seeing all of the public policy around keeping them within their place.
Absolutely.
They don't want to give up their power. Yeah.
They don't want to give up their power, but guess what? We're coming for it. And that's why I'll just say, as much as I talk about the anxiety that comes from being a boots on the ground activist, I have never lost hope in the last year and a half. In fact, I am more hopeful than I ever have been, because when I see all the work that they're doing to disenfranchise Black voters, I know it's because they know we are coming and we are a force, and particularly Black women. If you look at what Georgia did, I'm not just talking about, turning Georgia blue, but throughout the state, in those local races that happened this year, we were flipping seats. You were seeing young Black women elected as mayors in towns where we are not the majority. You were seeing DAs winning seats when they were told, sit to the side, it's not your turn. And look at Fannie. So, I say that to say, I see the progress we're making. I see the need to continue to train up a new crop of instigators and agitators to get into that good trouble that John Lewis talked about. So I'm not weary. And I am not tired. I have rested and I'm ready to get back in the fight. And so I am hopeful as a people that when we take that time out to refresh, relax, and rest, that we can come back in the fight and come back even stronger than we were before, because in 2022, they better get ready for us.
Yeah. So in terms of this, the being refreshed and having faith, we have a question with regards to young activism. How can we energize our young activists with faith and trust in continuing the movement here in America, despite living through the Trump years and Biden's unsuccessful bills?
I mean, I have to tell you, the young activists are energized, y'all. Like, I think, and I say young because I used to think I was young, but now I'm sort of that middle age, right? But when I was moved to tears when I was out there in May and June of 2020, because the kids were out there, y'all. I'm talking about 16, 17, 18, 19, early 20s, students that were in professional schools. We have so many colleges and universities right here in Atlanta, and they were out there, they were organizing. They didn't just go out there to march in the street, or as the news media would have liked to cover. They didn't go out there to loot. They went out there to exercise their right. They were registering voters when they were out there. They were talking about the advancement of certain bills, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, when after he passed away. They were out there talking about these things and educating each other about these things. And so what we need to do as older activists is get out of their way. We have a habit sometimes of thinking that they have to do it the way we did it in order for it to be done right, but they got the numbers out there. And the reality is that hate crime bill in Georgia, we may not have seen it pass when it did, but for those young folk in the middle of a pandemic taking it to the street. The older folk, some of us were out there, but some of us couldn't afford to be out there because of COVID-19. The
Right.
young people said, let us put this movement on our back. And again, when we talk about the media, and I know we're running up on the end of our time, but that was one of the points I know you wanted to touch on, Nadia. The
Yes.
media had a way throughout that summer of only focusing on this very small minority of individuals who are out there to agitate and cause violence and looting. But what did we start to see with these cell phone cameras? These Black activists were recording white folk out there who were the ones who were looting, who were setting fire to police stations. It was not us. And so again, I think while it may be hard to remain optimistic for those younger voters, what we as older voters and those who have been around for a little longer have to continue to do is, when we see them becoming hopeless, to continue to pour into them, pour resources into them, pour money into them, pour time into them, mentor them in this. And because I'm telling you, they're out there. They're out there and they're already doing an amazing job in terms of, they would get on Instagram and Snapchat and have thousands of people lined up ready to march in the streets in an hour's time. So we just have to continue to teach them how to channel that energy and turn that energy in the streets into advocacy for legislation, advocacy for things such as the Freedom to Vote Act that's pending in Congress, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So, but they're doing an amazing job, and I just continue to look forward to what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is just affirming and validating them, and I have a lot of, honestly, I have several white clients that, will continue to raise DE&I issues in their workspace. And even when that's not where the conversation is, they're always bringing it back. They're always bringing it back to advocacy. And so encouraging them to continue to live that.
Absolutely. And I like the suggestion of channeling that energy in a focused direction. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat that have come up in reference. So really quick, are there any organizations that come to mind where an individual can become involved to be a part of starting good trouble?
Oh yeah, and here in Atlanta area, you have the New Georgia Project. You have the ACLU of Atlanta that was engaged in these organizations. Black Voters Matter Fund. I mean, they are boots on the ground. In fact, Latasha Brown, one of the co-founders, talks about these southern states. These aren't red states. These are voter suppressed states down here in the South. So getting with those organizations, you have Sora Helen Butler is the CEO of the Poor People's Agenda. Like there are a number of Poor People's Campaign. There are a number of organizations in this area that are doing really good work. And again, you can Google to get that contact information. Anybody who has any interest, you can always reach out to me as social action chair, social action at asacdst.org if you need any suggestions on organizations that you can recommend for students. And I mean, even organizations such as ASAC's Delta Youth Programs, if we spend at least a month with our students, once a month with our students, talking about ways that they can become advocates and get involved, even from 6th grade on to high school. So there are a number of different organizations in the area that people can connect with.
Sharice, the other thing that's striking to me is every time I go to vote, there's still 72-year-old ladies at the polls. And I think that even if the women on this conversation say, I don't know if I can put another long-term commitment on my plate, I think even a one-off that you'll spend a day helping to get people registered to vote, helping to volunteer at the polls, I think even that is one other thing that we could do. But again, every time I go to the poll, I'm looking at women who look like my grandmother still.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And let's see, let me go to since we're coming down to the wire, our next question that we have that's come up in the chat is related to self-help during this time. Would journaling be helpful when experiencing the anxiety as we are watching how we're being treated on social media and the messaging that's out there and the laws that are being passed that are to certain communities' deficits? Would journaling be helpful? Are there any other ways to best support our coping during this time? And understanding that we're in a space that we will need to continue to be in terms of pushing the agenda of having equity across all cultural groups with regards to our legal rights. Any suggestions as it relates to that?
Yeah, I think the journaling is awesome, but I think the other thing that I often talk to my clients about when it comes to their anxiety is to talk to your anxiety, to really view anxiety as your dashboard, like when the lights are starting to flash and you're starting to signal that there's something wrong, to kind of recognize that and talk to your anxiety, ask it, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? And sometimes it's saying, don't go out and march in the streets. What if we get shot? What if it's all of your fears? So addressing those fears and acknowledging to yourself that there's some risk. There's some risk in having the conversations with your coworker. There's some risk in going out and being an advocate. There's a risk in standing up for your rights, but also being able to tell your anxiety, I've got this, like I'm not going to be out late while people are looting, or if things start to feel a little bit stressful, I trust myself. I'm going to listen to my instincts. I will leave an environment that doesn't feel comfortable for me. But I think the other thing is, for people who are taking their children with them, getting an assessment of where are we going to be? What are the rules? What am I going to have a conversation with my child about in terms of staying together or whatever? And at the point where I say it's time to go, like listening to your instinct and knowing that it's time to go. And that's knowing what your limits are, knowing, being very clear about what is your capacity to contribute. And not all of us can get out there and march, but what's your role, and figuring out what is your lane and holding your lane.
And also I'll add to that because one thing that was really validating for me was to also get back into reading. So a book that I'm actually reading now, I don't know if you can see it with my background, but it's called Hood Feminism: Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. And it, it really talks about how the modern day feminist movement has a glaring blind spot, and quite frankly, it's Black women. Because the mainstream feminist movement has been focused on basically elevating the plight of few of us. And so sometimes, like when I'm having certain anxiety about certain issues, I'll just go, get lost in a book on the subject because it validates my experience, right? Like when you're trying to build these coalitions with non-Black activists for various issues, sometimes we encounter this friction and tension between the two. And so journaling, but then also, reading and getting into some of these, there's so much literature nowadays, not just these types of books with scholarly articles, if that's your thing, to really educate yourself, because then when you're armed with more information, you become a better activist. So sometimes it's taking a step back and studying and being informed, so that when you're going into these spaces and these conversations, you're doing it in a way that's not going to harm the movement, but going to continue to further the movement in terms of what we're asking for and why we're asking for it.
Yeah, and the last thing I actually wanted to add was just seeking support. So whether that's getting feedback from, family members, friends, sorors, your church community, to make sure that you have those spaces where you're able to talk about how you're feeling and how you're experiencing all of this. Also being clear with people when you are overwhelmed and you don't have capacity to continue to have these conversations. And at the point where the anxiety is not well self-managed, giving some consideration to whether or not you need to seek a therapist, or whether or not you're open to talking to your primary care physician about switching medications or going on a medication. Because I think that's the other thing that we don't always acknowledge, that, if we haven't had a physical in a while, that your thyroid could be acting up, and that could be the source of your emotional issues. Where a lot of us are at a chapter of our lives where our hormones are kind of up and down. That could be the source of our emotional issues. But, there's an acronym that I was using called BLACK. So that's when you're feeling stress or anxiety, is to make sure that you're taking the time to breathe. That most of the time we're walking around taking shallow breaths, that you're taking deep breaths, that you do a body scan and just kind of be aware of where your body is in space. And then also, asking the questions and communicating. When you recognize that, that all of this information is a little bit overwhelming, that it's fine to turn off the television, to stop taking in all of the information, and, to get it in doses. Particularly, Nadia had mentioned earlier, January 6th, like so many people were consuming that information in real time. At some point, a lot of us needed to step back and just get the cliff notes. Like, we don't all need to read the entire book. And the same thing happened for me during George Floyd's murder, and then also the trials, is I couldn't consume all of that information and still be 100% for my own family and for my clients. So just kind of recognizing, like, I set aside a time at the end of the day when I was willing to kind of check in and get the bullet points, but I did not need the hour by hour, blow by blow details of that man's murder. It just was too much for me.
Yeah, and I think the same is true when we talk about how the media has an impact on us, right? I had to get to a point where I would no longer watch videos of Black people dying at the hands of law enforcement. I made sure I was fully informed, but it's like we've become desensitized to death and murder when we are literally watching people die on camera, on social media. on TV, and it's funny because certain news stations will say we're blocking out this portion of the video because it's graphic. And so you may get it filtered that way, but then I pick up my cell phone and I'm scrolling through Facebook. And at the time, I also had to turn off that feature where videos would automatically play, because that video of George Floyd being murdered was automatically playing, and it was on. I mean, my entire news feed some days were full of that video, and I just said this was too much. And I had to take a step away for my own mental health. I really did. So yeah, we have to make sure we're filtering what we're seeing, what our children are seeing. It's sad when you don't want to shelter your children, but you also don't want them to have so much exposure in a way that you can't help them process it, and it's going to create anxiety in them. And so I've had to be more mindful, even when I'm watching certain programming or listening to certain programming. I listen to NPR in the car a lot, right? And there are times when I have to just, okay, my kids are getting in. Let me have a conversation to make sure they understand the context of some of these conversations that are happening. I do want them to be informed. I do want them, if you know them, they're my little mini advocates already. But I have to recognize when it's becoming overwhelming for them.
And we have one more question that came through that actually ties into having conversations with kids, with young adults. The question is, as an educator, K through 12 educator that has to discuss the past with their students, how do you find empowerment in our history, where we as educators don't begin traumatizing our kids with the truth? Is there a way that we, and not just the truth of our history, but the truth of our lives, that this state that we are in, this place where we cannot change our color of our skin. So for our lives, we are in this state of living with a certain level of anxiety when you go out of your house. That becomes a norm, and being able to manage that. But how do we, we're all mothers here. You both have mentioned that you've had to have certain political, racial discussions with your children already. What suggestions would you give to K through 12 educators that feel compelled to tell the truth to their students, but not wanting to traumatize them at the same time or cause them to feel depressed?
Yeah, I mean, the trauma that, a lot of the conversations that were being had about critical race theory, and I was, just as an aside, so disappointed to hear Condoleezza Rice supporting this notion that we should not be discussing critical race theory. But, all of wars are traumatic. The Holocaust is traumatic. The Great Depression was traumatic for people who lived through it. But we talk about these things in a fact-based way that isn't emotional. It's just what happened. And so I think the biggest shame on this country was chattel slavery. They want us to forget that happened. Jewish people will not ever let you forget the Holocaust, and we should not. And I think it's the same thing with chattel slavery. It's just recognizing that we were a young country in comparison to the rest of the world, that we had some growing pains, that we made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of things that were trial and error. There are things there are mistakes that we're still making today. But I think that becomes the hope in it, is stating these things as facts. These things occurred. There were Japanese internment camps. We don't get emotional about that as Black people. We just say, oh, those poor Japanese people were pulled out their house and put on camps. How long were they in those camps? That's a damn shame. But are we able to have those same conversations with our children about our own histories, about where our grandmothers came from and the resilience of our grandmothers? And I think the interesting thing for us as Black folks is Blackness is not a monolith. I know there are people in this conversation right now who have educated grandparents, whose grandmother was a teacher, whose grandparents went to Howard, whose grandparents were from the Caribbean, whose grandparents were doctors and lawyers and landowners. And so I think, as much as we talk about the negative things that have happened, there are so many wonderful things that have happened throughout the course of history for Black people, for women, for people, for Native Americans, for marginalized people. So I think for me, in talking to children, it's talking about the facts of the things that didn't work out so well, the places where we really made a hard left and did not course correct fast enough, and but also talking about the hope. And I think that goes back into that advocacy piece. Like, look, we haven't done all of the work. We have left plenty of work for you all to do. These are the things that the opportunities that you will have as a result of all of these struggles.
And I would just add to that, I think you can make certain little minor tweaks to your language. I was impressed when I went on the field trip to the Atlanta History Center with my daughter a couple years ago, and she went to a predominantly white school. And when the presenter was talking about the one of the former enslaved persons, he asked the question and the student raised his hand and said yes because they were slaves, and the guy said no, that was an enslaved person. He would not allow them, that tour guide would not allow those white students to call those people who lived on that plantation slaves. And that was something that was so minor, but it made a difference. And I noticed that by the time we were leaving, those students were no longer using that term slave in the way in which they had, because that was almost demeaning and dehumanizing. That was a doctor, that was a lawyer, that was a homemaker, before they were pulled into slavery. And so I think you can make certain tweaks with respect to language that are subtle, right? So you're not going to offend that white parent, so to speak, who doesn't want their child to learn critical race theory, because most of them don't even know what that is. Let's be real clear about that. They don't even know what that is. It was politicized and they ran with it. And that's how, and again, people won elections. Look at what happened in Virginia. They won elections with that term, using that term. And but so you can make small changes to language, and then you can focus on the good things, yeah, that happened for us as a people. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, and I grew up in a majority Black school, but we learned about Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and maybe certain aspects about who Malcolm X were. There were so many more people, and more Black excellence that we've seen in this country. We can focus on that, introducing these kids to some of these other individuals who did amazing things, who are continuing to do amazing things. And that's how, when you arm them with excellence, they will be excellent.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of being armed with information, both the positives and the negatives, and in terms of social media and its presentation that has impacted our levels of anxiety and our levels of comfort when we go out, all of this can become desensitizing to us, where, as Sharice mentioned, over and over, we see these videos, and some of us have to say, I can't watch it anymore. Some of us see these videos and it becomes, in order, our natural coping mechanism is we have to figure out how to normalize it in some way. And so sometimes we can see these videos over and over of individuals that are dying, and we become desensitized to the human component of that. How would you, or what would you suggest an individual do to get back to becoming more humane and human, and in reference to feeling and being empathetic to situations that they witness or hear about, to continue to tap into our common similarity of, we are all people that want to live and have a life where we can care for ourselves and our families?
So I would
I
say,
was Go ahead,
oh, go
Trace.
ahead.
Mhm.
I
No,
was just gonna
insist.
say, as a Black woman, to be honest with you, and this is gonna be interesting, right? Because we're using Facebook as a platform to have this discussion. I had to learn, and I'm still learning, to be more intentional about how I interact with information on social media. And because think about it, you had that whistleblower at Facebook who blew the whistle, right? Fairly recently, that Facebook had data and they knew that the way in which their algorithm worked was likely to cause harm to certain communities, Black communities in particular, around the election and around racial injustice issues, and young people around body image and things such as that, particularly their app Instagram. They knew that. They did nothing to course correct, but they continue to monetize. So social media by design has been monetizing off of racial stressors for Black folk. And so knowing that, because I know there are certain times when I've just said, remark that, that white man said X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden I'm muted for 24 hours. But I've seen white folk using the N word with the hard ER, and they're not even getting muted. So how is the algorithm penalizing me for just pointing out that somebody is white and not even doing so in a derogatory manner? But I'm seeing individuals who are using racial slurs, and the algorithm isn't picking that up. So I had to learn to be more intentional in terms of how I interact with social media. Certain websites that I used to frequent, I don't go to, or if I go to, I won't go into the comments. I don't go back and forth with trolls anymore. I'm not changing anyone's mind in a comment section on Facebook, on some of those articles. And then I've had to, and I'm an introvert. Those of you who know me are probably going like, what? But I am. I'm an introvert to my core. And I had to realize that I had to start interacting with people again on a human level, connecting with people outside of social media, because, the pandemic made it so that we almost had to rely on social media for those of us who were there for interaction, because we couldn't gather together. And I've had to take it off of social media, schedule Zoom meetings with my friends to get together and discuss things and check in on each other, spending time with my children, putting electronics down, and just spending time checking in with them, seeing how things are going. Because even in middle school and high school, these kids were reacting to news of certain things, and dealing with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There were discussions that were happening even for them. And so I had to be more intentional about how I interact with social media, and to start spending time with people again, to get back to my humanity. And again, just to remind me what I do this for and who I do it for.
But I think also, when we talk about murders that are committed by people who have a badge, one of the conversations I've often had is why is it that those people are so afraid, and what is it about our culture that puts Black men in a position where they're seen as less than kind, less than generous, that they're viewed as mischievous. And I think continually having those conversations with Black men and boys about their humanity and about their ability to be vulnerable in safe spaces. And then the other thing that I've alluded to earlier is that I have lots of conversations with white people, some of which I know don't have the same education as me. And so I think entering into those conversations with a certain level of compassion, because some of their ignorance is their fault and some of their ignorance is not. But if they are willing to listen, if they are willing to learn, being able to point them in a different direction and offer them a different perspective. As Sharice mentioned, we may or may not change their minds, but I take every opportunity when I'm out with other people and engaging with other people to have those heartfelt connections, to look people in the eyes, to smile at people, to hold the door, to also tap into my own humanity, because it is very easy, particularly in these times, to stay within our bubbles. So where I have the opportunity is to step out of my comfort zone and have conversations with people who may not have the same views as me.
Thank you so very much to both of you for being here. This conversation has been extremely dynamic in all aspects related to race, related to politics, and of course, social media, or excuse me, and your mental health. I am going to put our QR code up. We have our co-chair, Dr. Janella Burse, who will share a final message, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. This was absolutely phenomenal. They said so much, yet we could continue to talk about this forever because this is the life we're living. Thank you so much. And I'm going to say it loud and proud. Dr. Tavari Brown, Attorney Sharice Michelle Reyes. There are no words for what you did tonight. Thank you so, so much. Also, thank you to our Mental Health Mondays chair, Dr. Nadia Barnett, our physical mental health chair, Rashawn Mitchell Jefferson, and of course, our chapter president, Madam President Sabrina Clark. And most of all to you, the audience, for joining us tonight. So what's next? January 17th, 2022, Triumph Over Tragedy. We will explore ways to continue living beyond loss, how to develop coping mechanisms by embracing healthy living and incorporate self-care. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you in 2022.